You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by...
Carter Lavin.
Hey, Carter. How's it going?
It's great. It's transit month here in the Bay Area. So this weekend we just did a big Rosie ride. People taking the ferry from SF to Richmond, and yeah, a lot of good stuff happening in the transit world.
Yeah. So what's the Rosie ride and what's the significance? I mean, I know, I'm sure most people have heard, if they're from the United States anyways, of Rosie the Riveter, but can you give us some background?
Yeah. So for Transit Month, transit agencies and transit advocates across the Bay Area put together all sorts of fun pro-transit events. Basically, get people on the bus, literally, have a good time. In the Bay Area, we are home to the Rosie the Riveter Homefront Visitor Center, which is a great part of American history and feminist history and, frankly, high-tech history. It's an extremely interesting museum, and it's in Richmond, California, basically 200 feet from the Richmond Ferry. So for the Rosie ride is the ferry trip from downtown San Francisco to Richmond to tour the museum. There's a nice lunch spot right next door, and folks come back. And it's just one of those great examples that people from all over the world come to San Francisco, people from all over America come to San Francisco, and the number of them that know about Rosie the Riveter or like recognize the We Could Do It icon is pretty high. Like, she's an international icon. And the number of people know that, oh, you could just take the ferry from that building, that beautiful building you're taking the photo of, and go to that museum. You know, people don't know about that. And so the Rosie ride is kind of a nice package experience, so people recognize, like, oh, this is the boat. You can go over. Those boats aren't just pretty pictures. They're actual transportation items that you can, hop aboard.
That's awesome. I actually haven't been, I've been to Richmond, but I haven't been to the museum. I probably should go. There's a lot of places, though, that are interesting and fun and exciting and places that we should go, but we generally don't because for some reason or another, I don't know why. I haven't been to Alcatraz, for example. I mean, I've lived here for 18 years or so.
Well, and I think that's, as we talk about some of the news items of today and the politics of it all, that the world's really big. It's really easy to not do things. And so if folks want a more transit-friendly world, it is our job to make it very easy and package it to people to say, yeah, Jeff, you should go any Saturday or Sunday, 205 ferry from gate F, hop aboard. Like, that's on us to do all that work.
Yeah, for sure. So Carter, for those who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Carter Lavin. I train transportation advocates and activists across America. I work with both individuals who are working on their little project and need help with that. And I work with advocacy groups, both all volunteer groups and some with staff, to help them learn how to fight stronger and win bigger fights.
Like you said, it's Transit Month in San Francisco. That's very exciting. Do you have other things planned for Transit Month? Are there other places and things that people can do?
Yeah, so I'm helping put on 8 events throughout Transit Month. I already did the Transit Stops Drunk Driving Happy Hour in Oakland, which was a lot of fun. Coming up, we have an event with Anti-Police Terror Project about transit and the justice system, working with Seniors Disability Action on transit and accessibility. And there's a transit hike and a lot of stuff on the Transit Month calendar folks can check out at the San Francisco Transit Riders website.
Awesome. Well, thanks to everybody who's been ordering your bus and bike scarves. We really appreciate that. Go to the Overhead Wire and get those. If you want to order 5, we'll give you a 10% discount. Email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. It's not cold out yet, but it is September, so we're going to be ramping up our scarf hawking pretty soon to make sure folks can get more of those. Also, don't forget to buy any of the books we've covered on the show on the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. Check it out if you get a chance. And we've designed a t-shirt with Richard Wazinski called Cars or Cholesterol, and you can actually go to TeePublic and you can get anything you want. The image is really cool. You can go and get a mug or anything along those lines. So it's pretty cool. bit.ly/cars or cholesterol. So this is episode 140. We're getting closer to 150. I'm actually pretty impressed that this has been going on for so long. We're live and in session with Carter. And before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast Talking Headways on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Cast, of course, Apple Podcasts as well. And sorry to the Stitcher listeners. I hope that you hopped over from Stitcher to another podcatcher so you can listen to the show continuing. We appreciate it if you get on podcatchers because that means you get the show every week and we don't need to keep selling it to you. So here's the news, and this is what folks are here for. They want to hear what's going on in the world of transportation and urbanism and planning and all those things. Here's a few of the news items that were popular in the Overhead Wire this week. The newsletter that I send out every day. If you want to get a free trial 2 weeks, go to theoverheadwire.com and sign up. And if you sign up and then unsubscribe, I delete the email right away. So you don't have to worry about it disappearing and going other places or getting some weird spam because you signed up for my email. It doesn't happen. So I clean the list pretty intently to make sure that everybody stays safe. So, okay, should we get started, Carter? Are you excited to get started on the news?
Let's roll.
All right.
Yeah.
Depaving cities. With extreme weather events like heavy rain events and heat waves becoming more severe and frequent, communities across the United States are starting to reconsider asphalt paving. Removing asphalt from schoolyards and backyards can have huge benefits, including reduced runoff, less absorbed heat, and results in lower temperatures. Now, a group called Depave Chicago is trying to bring more attention to the benefits of reducing impervious cover in the city. And this was by Lucy Sheriff in Nexus Media News. What do you think about the idea of depaving cities?
I mean, I think it's a critical element when we talk about how hot it's getting in Phoenix, in LA, in Bakersfield, in Austin, Texas. Like the temperature is only going up. And a great part about depaving is it both reduces the urban heat island effect and it also frees up space. One of the best ways to depave, sure, make a park, also make an apartment building. The more folks you get in a city, the less sprawl you have is great. And I think the other thing that's really fun about depaving is anyone with a pickaxe can do it. Pickaxe and a shovel. I think sometimes we always look to the federal government or someone else with a big paycheck to fix this, but something that most communities can say, yeah, sure, let's dig up that old parking lot and at least put a garden there in the meantime. And you say, okay, folks, let's get digging, like roll up the sleeves, let's go.
Yeah, you just have to have permission from the property owner, or maybe not if you decide to go a little guerrilla.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also one of those things where there's so many people who have such energy, and it's just really a question about how do you harness it. I jokingly say if you told the CrossFit community that they're allowed to dig up anything they wanted to, they'd get their reps in. But it's something that I think on a more serious level, when we look about how wide our roads are, especially in our kind of pandemic era transportation patterns, our roads are big opportunities to depave or change up and really, kind of create more of that green space, create some more of that people-friendly space, because it is very unpleasant, walking around a hot summer day at most places. We need shade, we need cool grass, and we need a lot more stuff.
Well, you and I actually walked up Sanchez recently, and one of the things that I noticed when we were walking, and I noticed every time I walk down Sanchez, is just how wide it is. And it's not a through street. It ends at 30th, and it ends at the hill on, around, Dolores Park somewhere. And so it doesn't go through anywhere, but it is just a street in Noe Valley that goes from one end to the other. And now it's an open street. And it's so wide. It doesn't need to be that wide, right? It's nice, I guess, if you're out there walking and if you're learning how to ride a bike, maybe you don't hit the curbs on the sides. Yeah. But it's so wide that you could probably cut it down by half and still have access for the fire trucks and the delivery trucks and maybe a couple parking spaces.
And you'd save so much money on maintenance costs. I mean, I think, frankly, a lot of cities have depaving plans already. Just look where your asphalt is crumbled. Just look where they've stopped maintaining. And depaving is really just sort of the collective acceptance that, hey, we don't actually want this to be paved, right? Because if your city actually cared about it, then they'd maintain it, they'd pave it up. But any place where there's cracks and plants growing through, you say, okay, well, let's just take a shovel to this. And clearly this isn't actually so needed. And I think that there's a lot of cities in the Midwest in particular that have a lot of opportunity for this. There's a lot of, this was years ago, but there's a lot of Detroit as a city kind of reconsolidating, and that was a big depaving story itself. And I think at the end of the day, this concept of what are the parking islands that are surrounding the abandoned strip mall? And you say, okay, well, we have big plans for the abandoned strip mall. It's going to one day be the Amazon warehouse center or whatever. Okay, well, in the meantime, that probably won't happen. In the meantime, why don't we just rip up some pavement and have some fun? And not that I'm encouraging anyone to do any illegal activities. I would never, of course, condone that on a podcast. But a fun thing about depaving is people can just do it. Not that anyone should do that. but it's a thing.
And there's easy targets too. I think what the article points out too is that one of the first projects the group that calls itself Depaving put together was somebody's backyard just was paved in concrete, and instead of having local plants or anything along those lines. So they basically took the pickaxes and they cut it out. And I think that happens in a lot of places where it's not just the roads, which obviously the roads are a big target because 30% of streets and roads take up 30% of the land in the United States in urban areas. And some places like New York, it says in the article like 61% or something along those lines. But these simple places, the kids' playgrounds where it's just concrete because they want to have a basketball tarp and then they also don't want to take care of the plants. So there's a number of places that you can start with that aren't the streets necessarily, and then you'll get to the streets later, I feel like.
Yeah, there's a lot of front yards paved over. There's a lot of abandoned buildings with 10 parking spots around it and a fence or something like that no one's touched it for years. There's all sorts of spots. And I think one of the fun things about when people are tuned into Depaving, once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. And when you say, oh, well, shouldn't that just be a hedge, a bush, or whatever? It could be a lot of things. It doesn't have to just be kind of cracked and crummy looking pavement.
Yeah, for sure. All right, next up. And I think this is actually related to the Depaving, which is why I put the Depaving first. Land for a new city. A who's who of Silicon Valley heavyweights has purchased almost $1 billion worth of land near Travis Air Force Base between Sacramento and the Bay Area to build a new city. For 4 years, a group called Flannery Associates had been buying up farmland at above market rate prices, but incorporating into a city would require a vote in Sonoma County, and the group has already upset local politicians and residents. This was by Karen Breslow and Tom Giles in Bloomberg via Fortune is the link that we got because there was a paywall for Bloomberg, so we found the Fortune article, which is the same exact article. Yeah, so basically the New York Times reported that there's more than 100 unexplained land purchases, and people were like, who is this group that's buying this up? Oh, it's a bunch of tech moguls with billions of dollars to spend.
I have so many opinions on this. Okay, how to structure it. So step one, if you don't want sprawl in communities, if you want to preserve farmland, you need state laws and local laws and county laws to preserve farmland. Same thing with wildland, same thing with green spaces. So for communities who are furious about this and you think, oh, well, this could never happen here, great, preemptively pass the law. Get your community, get your county to pass a law saying, hey, let's just be very clear. This is farmland. It's going to stay farmland. It is important that we preserve that. So first off, that if you don't have that, if you don't protect it, you're going to lose it. The second is if I had $1 billion and wanted to create housing, it would not cost $1 billion to run an entire slate and basically take over the San Francisco County supervisors. It would not cost $1 billion. If you said, I'm going to spend $1 billion and get every elected official in the Bay Area to be your person, $1 billion is an absurd amount of money. And politically, you could do that. And to just do it to buy land is such a funny interpretation of risk, because I think a lot of times when these like tech moguls say, oh, I'm going to just buy land and build a city, it's about control. I think for these folks, it's about control, that they feel very comfortable saying, well, I buy a land, I have control. And it's like, yeah, unfortunately, you don't actually control the land you own. You don't have that level of control that you think you do. And they say, well, I don't want to do politics because I can't control it. It's like, fun fact, you have just as much control over the politics as you do about the land. And it's
if
not
you have that much money, unfortunately.
And it's not even, oh, they need to put their cousins and get them to be the mayor of San Francisco. Although for $1 billion, you could have a potato become the mayor of San Francisco. Like $1 billion is just so much money in the world of politics. It just, I don't know. These people get praised for being so smart, and I think that's a ridiculous use of money, even if, like, regardless of outcome. But if their goal is, I want to create a lot of housing in the Bay Area, there's just far cheaper ways of doing it.
Well, let me address the money issue first. I think, and I don't know if this is actually true or not, but I think that when you get to a certain point where you have this much money, you start to wonder what to do with it, because there's not the same amount of value investments that you can put your money in that will actually make a return for you. And so we've actually heard from Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, who, basically made all their money from Berkshire Hathaway, that they actually are sitting on billions and millions of dollars because there's nowhere to put it. right? They're just sitting on it because there's nowhere for them to put it where they feel like they would get the adequate return that they deserve.
I'd be perfectly happy for us to call it the Berkshire Hathaway Charlie Munger high-speed rail from LA to San Francisco.
I would too.
Just,
I mean, like they probably do have $100 billion sitting around. Like I don't doubt that. Like somewhere in, it's probably actually more like 30 or something. But still, that would go a long way to putting into high-speed rail.
yeah. They could
So
just do
I
it.
feel like, and this is all speculation, of course. This is not. There's no underlying.
You're not talking with Charlie. You're not hanging out with Warren
I'm
Buffett.
not, no, or Mark Andreessen or any of those people, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like when you have that much money and then you're like, oh, well, I'm also upset with the politics of, and you just mentioned, obviously you could pay for a lot of politics with that much money, but I'm upset with this politics. I've built stuff from the ground up, from scratch on software and things like that. So maybe we could just build a city from scratch and that would be a great idea. Unfortunately, humans don't act like act like packets of digital information. And so it's frustrating from that point where they're basically taking their money and they're buying up a bunch of property. And I've actually thought about this. I was like, if I had $1 billion, I could buy up a bunch of land on Geary and then build a subway that connects all of it, right? And instead of doing like things like that might be more productive and still a bit crazy, they want to go just buy a whole part of California.
Take their ball and run home. It's cheaper than Mars and feels slightly more realistic.
Right.
But
and so but you see this happening too in Hawaii with Zuckerberg and Larry Ellison and other people who bought basically whole islands and things like that, right? Like this is their MO to a certain extent. They're like, well, if I can't do this where I am, I'm going to buy my island and then control it completely.
Yeah.
The second thing that I want to address is the ecological issue that you mentioned in terms of sprawl and farmland. And we just had Ben Holland and Zach Subin on to talk about basically the importance of land use when you're thinking about transportation emissions. And that's a big issue. But also, one of the things that they found from their study that they were looking at was that reducing sprawl actually reduces the amount of land that's consumed by impervious cover that we just talked about in the previous link. And so, ecosystem services is a thing. It is important. That land is actually valuable as sitting there as the way it is in terms of, the environmental impact that it has. And leaving it like that would actually bring more value than probably putting 100,000 people there. And so there's that issue as well. I have a whole bunch of other stuff that I could kind of, expound upon, but those are my two big things is like, they're trying to park money, right, in some form or fashion. And for a lot of folks who have too much money, it's land. And then they think that building a new city will basically exempt them from the politics, as you mentioned, and the legal issues and the limits of humans that come with people living in these places.
I think this is almost like an emergent property of the whole concept of there's a certain level of wealth that people stop telling you no about, and that you just don't have to hear negativity and criticism. What eventually that gets to is people wanting to create their own universe, like their own, Marvel Cinematic Universe that they're the star and that they're the person in. And not only is it wrong and foolish and wasteful and all these things, it also, frankly, sounds desperately lonely that, these people live in cities now, they live in communities now, and they don't want to talk to people in it. And like that sucks for them. I like my neighbors. I like talking to my neighbors. I like walking down the street, bumping into folks. And whatever type of feeling that they have that they need to create their own city or they can't get involved. And I live in the Bay Area. A lot of my friends have been displaced in terms of housing, and I get the desire to build a lot of housing. For $1 billion, you could buy everyone in the Bay Area who has a backyard, an ADU. You could just put a college up for free, and boom, all of a sudden add 200,000 people to the Bay Area or something pretty quickly. So they have a lot of options, and I think they lack vision, frankly.
Well, yeah. I mean, there was an article actually this week in, I think it was Fast Company or something like that, where, Amazon and some other these larger companies were trying to, create revolving loan funds to the extent that they were loaning out money to nonprofit developers and folks like that. They are not going to solve the housing crisis like that. But then at the same time, they actually proved that in places like Washington, D.C., there's a huge desire for building affordable housing units. If they put together this systematized program for spending money, and they actually got their money back, right? They spent money on creating loans for these developers, and then they got their money back. But they also created a bunch of affordable housing. 7,000 units isn't a huge amount of housing, but it's also not a drop in the bucket in terms of how much housing we need. It is a drop in the bucket, but it's not like an insignificant amount. And so, if you want to spend $1 billion on housing in the Bay Area, I'm sure there's a lot of nonprofit developers or affordable housers that are trying to stack up every little tiny piece of funding that they possibly can to build their one project. I'm sure that they could get help from them, which we found out that some folks like Mackenzie, formerly Bezos, is giving money. She just gave a bunch of money to a land trust here in San Francisco. And so at the same time, I feel like there's this want from these folks that they want to figure out a better way to build a city when the city is an organic creature. It's a function of the humans that live in it. It grows slowly over time. And we've seen this we've seen this movie before. We've seen this movie in Brasilia. We've seen this movie in places all over the world.
And we see it on Route 49. I mean, we see this on Route 49. California is littered with ghost towns. A lot of the American West is. A lot of the American Midwest is. Cities exist for reasons. Cities exist for reasons and become ecosystems for humans. And I'm glad we're talking about this. This is always a fun one. And it's something that there's always a temptation for folks who have all these means to create something new. But what you can do is, if you say revolving loan fund for ADUs or duplex conversions, when you have $1 billion, you can functionally act like a government in certain ways. And when you look at how the federal government responded to the housing crisis during World War II, a lot of it was revolving loan funds or kind of low interest loans for converting mansions to be duplexes, triplexes, things like that. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of growth and a lot of housing you can make for $1 billion that besides a city in Solano.
I want to ask though, too, where do you think this ends up?
Oh, okay. Where do I think this ends up? That is a good question. So I think this ends up, not that they have to sell everything, but they bought farmland. The land is bought for farms. They're going to try to get it rezoned. I think there's a bunch of lawsuits because I think they can't even use it for housing. It is literally farmland. I think some of it is probably already some form of protected. So my guess is it's not going to catastrophically collapse in a way that might be emotionally satisfying to some of your listeners. But I think what's going to happen is it'll just slowly stumble forward and probably just be the next, Nut Tree, Cordelia strip mall thing. When you look at the renderings of these pictures, what they are proposing is basically just an existing Tracy subdivision, kind of anywhere in America type thing. And that's my guess is what's going to probably end up happening. Hopefully what this inspires is a lot more state and local legislative action to create real urban growth boundaries. I think when we're talking about growth throughout Texas and all these other states in the country, there's a lot of places that don't have these types of growth management policies in place because they haven't had to deal with it. And I think this should be a very strong warning to anyone, frankly, listening in from all over the country who says, okay, well, could this happen here? And what would we want? And even if you don't have a billionaire knocking down your mayor's door saying, hey, we want to do this stuff, it's still good to have the policy saying, don't build here, let's go for it.
I'm just interested to see where it goes. I mean, I know that that John Garamendi has been against it. I think that Gavin Newsom was going to meet with them and scolded them publicly about it, which doesn't mean much from Gavin. I don't, he could turn on a dime. Who knows? But
he turns on slightly more than a dime, but yeah.
But I feel like it's going to be really tough for them to do this, and they have to get a vote in Sonoma County, which is really tough. I mean, Sonoma County has already thought through this to a certain Solano County. Did I say Sonoma? Yeah, it's in Solano. So they're both north. They're both up there. Yeah. They're not the same county, by the way.
It's one of those things where they have an absurd number of policy hurdles to get before it. They, as you already mentioned, they've already overspent on the farmland. So the concept of, let's just try to make it farmland is going to be hard. Economically, the desire to squeeze every penny they can out of this is pretty high. So there's probably going to be pretty crummy farming practices adopted in these territories. In the meantime, they're going to reach out to PG&E, the utilities, and say, hey, can you bring out utilities here and sewer line? There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen. And I hope folks who there's some folks who are going to make a lot of money off of this. I don't think it's those billionaires. I think it is going to be the contractors who say, hey, so you need a sewer system? I can build a sewer system, 10% down, and we'll start building it when you get your permits. I think there's a lot of, much like in the gold rush, the people who made the money weren't necessarily the miners, but it's the Levi Strausses, the jean makers, the pickaxe salespeople. And I think that we'll find out.
Yeah. What was the general store outside of Sacramento? It was one of the big four, anyways. That's how they made their money, was selling the stuff to the gold rush people. It might have been Mark Hopkins. I'm not sure exactly, but anyways, one of those folks. Yeah, and what was really funny too is that the folks that are selling the land to now Flannery Associates, this kind of shell company that they've created, is actually trying to sue some of them for collusion, trying to raise the prices. But I think also what's really funny is like sometimes I'll get these like spam emails basically saying like, we want to advertise on your site, and it's clearly from like Southeast Asia or India or somewhere like that, where somebody's trying to like basically scam you in one way or another. And so every once in a while, right, they're like, well, how much would it cost to like advertise on your platform so that we can put some news articles? And I say $1 million, and the guy comes back and basically says F you, like so mad. And so I want to say that these farmers or the folks at landowners, they were just like, people wanted to buy their land. They're like, I don't really want to sell it, but I want to see like what they like going to pay for it, right?
Yeah.
What's the screw you price? And so they're like, oh, well, you want to buy this? Well, I want $20,000 a square foot or whatever it is. Yeah. And so they're like, what? That's crazy. Why so high? And it's like, they don't really want to sell their land. They just want to see what you're after.
Well, and I think it's also going to be interesting. My guess is there's going to be some utility scale solar development that gets put up because like, I think these people recognize, okay, well, we do have a lot of land. We got this county thing. Like, what can we do? I don't think they're going to donate it for a nature preserve to memorialize the hubris of man, but that would be nice.
You don't think it's going to be a Mediterranean low density villa like the generative AI produced for them?
Yeah, exactly. That's what we need. A low density. California needs more low density. No, I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, anyways, like Cruise and Waymo, it's not about the safety, it's about the money. Here, it's about the money as usual, and the power that they probably won't get, in my opinion. So next up, don't call it public housing. Montgomery County, Maryland has been quietly building public housing by owning a large stake in private development that they use for the quote-unquote profits as a way to lower rents for lower and moderate income residents. The Laureate, the first building financed with $100 million from county raised funds for such projects, is a way to try and address the multiple housing challenges facing the region and the country as a whole without calling it public housing. This was by Connor Doherty in the New York Times. Thanks, Connor, for this one. This is a great article, and thinking about public housing. I wonder what your thoughts are on this one.
It actually hits close to home. I went to middle school and a little bit of high school in Bethesda, Maryland, and Montgomery County. So when some of these places they're talking about, like, I've been there, been in the area, and kind of like what we were saying before about the revolving loan fund. At the end of the day, there's a huge need for housing across America, especially in our cities, in our kind of near-end suburbs, and there's only so much housing you could do as a government if you are putting up the $700,000 or what have you to build the unit. But if what you're doing with that money is instead financing it, you can build a lot more. And if you say, then capture the value and getting the rents and using that to build more, that's a great thing. And I think with what they've been doing in Montgomery County, Maryland, and examples in other places, it's a great opportunity for communities to really stretch dollars and achieve greater goals. And for me, one of the things that really stuck out in this article too is I really liked how they said this is a kind of county-wide policy, that they weren't just trying to put housing in certain parts of the county, which Potomac, Maryland is a very hoity-toity area. And for them, Montgomery County, to say, yeah, we're going to put public housing there as well. I think it's really important that we kind of desegregate our society economically. And a part of how we do it is put apartment buildings next to single family homes and put single family homes next to some other apartments and duplexes and just mix it all together.
I really like this in the framework of public wealth. And the reason I think about it that way is because if you're spending money as a public entity and you're getting something out of it with the quote unquote profits, I feel like that there's a lot of value to be had around the country that way. All these cities and counties and government entities, they have a lot of value that they're creating through the investments that they make in infrastructure and those types of things, but also through the money that they spend and the land that they own. And so things like this actually show that there's a huge demand for, innovative solutions to our issues through spending money that we already have, right? So the public value is the value in the land, the value that you have from these revolving loan funds, those types of things. And you can see it, here, but also like in places around the world, they're doing this already. I mean, I just posted something this morning from Japan where Japan Post is basically taking 20 of its properties in Tokyo and redeveloping them because they want to diversify their streams of income away from just postal service and do other things. It's kind of the same way that obviously the railways operate there and in places like Hong Kong. So, we can actually use our land, our public land, for public good in this way, and it would actually benefit everybody instead of just keeping a hands-off approach and thinking about it as, oh, well, this is our fund and we're just going to give this money out to developers and they're going to build a couple of housing units and then we'll be done with it, rather than thinking of it as a long-term asset that they can actually parlay into all these other assets as well.
I mean, I think when we look at different communities and community improvements, like fundamentally, you do something to improve the community, the values go up, and who's going to capture that? A government agency capture that, and then what they should do is plow that money in. It is the Ponzi scheme, which is society, that every year our communities are a little bit better, a little bit healthier, a little bit safer. That's at least the goal. And with that wealth, we put that back into our communities. And this is not just infill from a very literal the housings go in thing, but it's kind of financial infill. When we do sprawl is a huge waste of money. It's tearing up green fields and farms and wild spaces to put stuff where there isn't anything before, or what isn't economic activity like that before, but instead investing in our communities and having that value go in. And I would love to see this with more community spaces. I think there's a lot of like nonprofit theater troupes and things like that, and museums and local institutions that aren't going to be able to exist because there's not this type of thing. If we talk about what is the next version of the postal service, like if we were to, there's this joke like you couldn't create the postal service today. If you tried to create it from scratch, imagine what people would flip out about. Same thing with libraries. But we need to create very low rent spaces in our cities so that all sorts of community group things could emerge from it.
I like that. Would you think that something like this along the same lines, not just for like housing, for rental housing, but for rental commercial spaces or things like that, where you have these low income things? I mean, up the street, I think I might have mentioned this to you, there's an empty storefront that's been empty for quite a while. It was a clothing store, and then before that was a corner store, but it's just basically an empty space, and they have paper up on the walls. And right before the pandemic, somebody wanted to put a cannabis shop in there, and that didn't happen, I guess, because of the pandemic. But if it was renting for super low rent, I would like go in there and build like a model train set or something and like have it run through the window just so something is it's activated and something's happening there. I think it would be super fun. And those are the types of things. Boom. Those are, yeah, exactly. But those are the types of things that don't happen at $8,000 a month rent, right? It's like crazy.
And it's one of those things where this is a big part about market price housing or market rate housing subsidizing other things. And that's honestly how our system functions across the board, that you have market rate housing subsidized X. And the question is, what's X? And so you could say, okay, we want to have a bunch of condos, 7 stories of condos, and there at the bottom there's going to be some commercial outlets. Like, well, if you have a commercial place, there's only so many commercial real estate needs a city has. But if you say what we're going to do is have that be a community space and they could do whatever, that becomes a lot more attractive. Now, developers have a mixed record on following through about that. I'm in Oakland, and there's a whole thing going on with the Kaiser Auditorium around that. That's too complicated for this right now. But when the city or a government agency is the actual end-all owner of the property, they have a much different incentive structure. So it becomes a lot easier for them to say, yeah, we'll rent this out to the local bookstore. Our goal is to make sure there is a thing there. And when the goal is that there's a thing there and not maximizing profit of that street space, you can get a lot more stuff there. My favorite example of this just locally I saw in Oakland is we were home to the video game museum, which I think is still there, maybe moved elsewhere. But basically it was just a bunch of people who during the recession realized that Class C office space in Oakland was pretty cheap, and buying a bunch of video games from yard sales of parents selling off their kids' video games was like really cheap. And then they put them all together, and now Oakland had a video game museum. And it's just one of those like, yeah, you can do more fun, weird stuff when kind of office space is cheap, which good news about today is there's a lot more cheap space in certain communities and certain cities. And it's just how it's structured, how it's accessible, that's the issue. And so we need to bring in different legal structures and financial structures to really unlock that space.
Yeah, before that, that space in Old Oakland was actually like a gamer space. Like people would meet up and do Warhammer or whatever
Yeah.
games, they Magic the Gathering or whatever every
Nice.
Tuesday or something.
Nice.
So that space has always been something fun. Should we go to the next one?
Sure.
Awesome. Teaming up on delivery truck design. General Motors' Wade Bryant was in New York City when he was struck with the huge amount of work delivery workers do to get customers their packages each day. His team then focused on designing zero emissions delivery vehicle from the perspective of the delivery worker, from handling packages to the large number of times workers have to get themselves in and out of the driver's seat. The result was the Zevo electric delivery van. This was by Nate Berg in Fast Company. So I really like this article. I always appreciate Nate's work. He always does a good job of presenting all the information in a great way. One of the first things I noticed about this article specifically was that the designer just happened to notice how hard it is to deliver packages. And I guess a lot of folks don't really think about this, but I feel like there's a lot of folks that are doing a lot of hard work that people don't pay attention to very much. Because I know that watching folks drag, all these Amazon boxes and things all over the streets, it seems like hard work to me. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think if you ask anyone in the UPS union what they thought about their working conditions, they would have probably talked about this. And I think this is a very interesting article because it's a worker power story. It's fundamentally a story about what happens from an innovation and technological standpoint when companies take worker well-being more seriously. And one thing that they don't talk about is, why did they say, oh, this guy just decided one day to start taking it seriously, and then G. Willikers, this multi-billion-dollar company, said sure. And I think the fact that there's this massive union organizing going on for UPS and all that stuff is like probably related to it, even if it's only just from the manufacturers want to suppress the desire for people to join unions by making them a little bit happier, like whatever the reason is. But worker power gets all sorts of goods. And I think it's also such a wonderful example from just a accessibility standpoint. Our world is not designed to be an accessible world. There's a lot from the ADA, but a lot of people are designed out of the system. And there's so much innovation that can happen when we point that innovation research canon at the way of accessibility and worker comfort. It felt very sci-fi in a solar punk type of way, and it made me think about like Becky Chambers, the sci-fi author, a lot. Like normally when I read about sci-fi type stuff in the news, it's kind of the dystopia. And I was like, yeah, no, but we can actually make things better for humans. And isn't that nice?
Yeah, it was really cool. And they were using, virtual reality goggles to figure out like what they were seeing out the vehicle and like accessibility from that perspective. I would like to have heard a little bit more about how they think about, active transportation users or vulnerable users outside of the vehicle, which they didn't mention in the article. But it was really good to hear them talk about, how many times people get in and out of the truck, how you have to bend over every time you're trying to get into the truck to get packages and those types of things. So, and this is only, when they're talking about personal deliveries, I mean, I think I wrote down it's like 1 billion deliveries a day between UPS, FedEx, and Amazon, basically, if you do the math and connect all that. But that's like a drop in the bucket compared to like all the commercial deliveries, right? And so there's all these people running around trying to, get people their goods. And it seems like, thinking about it from the perspective of the worker and the person that's doing that is pretty important. And it might actually get your goods delivered better as well.
And even if it doesn't, it obviates a lot of human suffering. And that in itself is very valuable. And I think one thing that's also absent, one thing I love about these articles is always like, what's the dog that didn't bark? So a federal regulator could have made this a law 30 years ago. Like the federal government could have done this from either a workplace protection thing, from a DOT perspective. Like a lot of times stories of corporate innovation are things that could have been forced a while ago. And this is something that I worked in the solar space for 17 years. So I see, I think a lot about the interplay between government and innovation. And one thing that government does really well when it does it is say to corporations like, hey, go innovate in that direction. We want you to kind of aim towards that way. And what companies are really good at doing is going very quickly in the direction that they choose or that they have to at the expense of all else. It's the role of government, local and otherwise, to say, okay, here's that direction that we want you to go in. And so, I really hope that DOTs and other government agencies and regulators say, okay, cool, let's make this a requirement. Like, let's make the worker safety part required. Because I remember, and that goes beyond the truck itself, it goes to the roads themselves. I once heard a talk from the insurance commissioner of California, and Commissioner Jones, years ago, and he said the most dangerous place for any worker in California and across the country is the road. The most dangerous thing that person does is commute to their job. Whether that's trucker, lumberjack, things like that, just the actual road itself. And so we really should be taking safety seriously, because we don't have to have these injuries. We don't have to have these types of problems. And so let's design them out. Let's fix it.
Yeah. All right, next up, increased state capacity lowers costs. New research takes a look at how state capacity impacts road paving projects and finds that when there are fewer public employees at state departments of transportation, costs increase due to having to outsource work to consultants. The number of consultants increased and the number of paving companies decreased, leading to higher bids and higher cost projects. This suggests that hiring more public sector workers in many different sectors could lower the overall costs of projects. This was by David Dayan in The American Prospect. This was a really interesting article, and it kind of like mirrors and echoes a little bit of what's been going on in the transit cost projects at Marin and at Eno, and we talk about those a lot on the show. But I found this was really interesting looking at it from something such as a road that's very basically clear cut. It's pretty similar how they're done in most states and places. And so I feel like the data actually is showing us something really interesting here related to how cutting that public sector capacity ends up in higher costs for taxpayers.
Yeah, this is a massive story. And I think it's also a fascinating one for listeners of different age groups. So I'm about to be 35. It's my birthday this week. And
Happy birthday.
Thank you. And as a millennial, I'm someone who's grown up in the shadow of the Reagan years. I've heard the statement, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." It's like a terrifying, I've heard that that's a joke. I'm a millennial. That makes no sense to me. Oh my God, do we need people helping? And I think there's this generation of folks, leaders above, who do kind of have this: the government governs best is the one that does it worst or least, or some ridiculous concept.
Stay out of my business kind of type of stuff.
Yeah, and that's ridiculous. And government can be inefficient and big. It could be inefficient and small. And I think for a lot of Gen Zers and millennials, we have this kind of generational frustration about how folks don't seem to be able to help us. And a big part is because the government's been starved to death for decades, except for military and police budgets and highway budgets, of course, not those folks. And it's something that we have so much more progress that we need to make to get the stuff we want to get. So for right now, for example, I'm in Oakland. I volunteer with a group about anti-traffic violence. And the most common refrain we hear all the time from politicians is, we totally support this, but we don't have the staff. And we hear from the city departments we totally support doing a protected bike lane. We don't have the staff. And so we say, okay, get the flipping staff. There are people who want to work. Hire. And it's so good to see in this report that this is kind of a systemic institutional failure across the country. And a big part of how we solve this is we fund the government, and we fund the parts of government that we want to fund. And for activists, when folks who listen into something like this, there's, I know, a temptation or a desire to say maybe some neoliberal solution and outsource, what have you, build your own city. And to an extent, some of that stuff works. Rotating loan funds is a fairly neoliberal solution. But having a functioning government is a pretty amazing, magical thing. And it's on us to fight for it. And so maybe you don't want higher taxes. That's fine if you don't want that. But there's parts of your government budget that are massively wasteful, and fighting against that for the funding you need is an essential part. Yeah, I'm very steamed. This is a whole thing. This is every aspect of society. When just anytime someone says, "Oh, why do they have nice things wherever? Why don't we?" It's because there's 3 people working in that department and they're all overstaffed, they're all understaffed and overworked. And it's our job as activists, as residents, as citizens, to say to our cities, yes, our police department that gets 40% of our budget is not keeping us safe. What we actually do need is a lot of speed bumps. And yes, please put $5 million from the police department to staff up on the speed bump department. And for some folks, that might seem like a ridiculous thing to ask for or want, but that is what's needed. We need to do the work of government. And Whew, okay, yeah, I'm never going to shut up about this. So you should say some things.
Well, I want to give the details of what the paper said because I think it's
Yeah.
really interesting. So, this is quoted from the paper from the article on the American Prospect. States whose DOT officials reported concerns about consultants correlate with significantly higher costs. Consultant-driven projects have fewer details, leading to more changes in project scope, which adds risks to the contractors and delays to the project. It also leads to less competition. So, according to the paper, just one extra bidder on a project drives costs down 8.3%. An increase in bidder outreach to get more companies to try for a project translates to 17.6% lower costs. So, in other words, basically, if you have more government people that can advertise that this project is available to more contractors, you can actually lower the costs. The cost of that advertising actually is equal to lower costs of the project because you can get more bidders and more people coming to that project. And the consultants, and as as somebody who worked as a consultant for a nonprofit for a long time, I can tell you that our job when we were at the nonprofit was trying not to come in and helicopter in and tell the local community what they should do or what they're going to have to do to get the thing that they wanted. But I don't think a lot of people actually operate like that. Consultants helicopter in, they tell you what you need to do, and then they leave you with the mess. And so I think that this is like a perfect example of that happening, where hiring consultants, they don't do as many details. The change orders are one of the big things that they talk about in terms of construction costs and what changes costs over time for big projects. And so I think that's something that this paper is showing specifically is part of the problem.
Well, and it's part of this is also where you have the staff is a key element. That, I mean, I think it's Cincinnati, or I forget where, there's a place that like the city onboarded their own department of just putting up traffic calming and just like literally owned the cement mixer, literally had those staffers, and they just did a ton of those. And that's great, but you can also get a lot done when the city staff are the ones who can approve the funding and approve designs and do it. When you say, hey, this is what we want, this is the exact specific design, who can perform this? Like when you're saying, I have the blueprints and we'll take bids, and have the private sector compete for itself to get the lowest bid on the thing that you want. You don't lower your standards, you make them lower their prices. That's a powerful thing. The government is a massively powerful entity to a level that other entities could never hope to be, and we shouldn't be afraid to use that. And a key part is staffing up strategically.
Another thing that's somewhat tangential but not specific to this article that I think is really important, there was actually a piece in the London School of Economics recently about rural employment and economic recovery after the Great Recession. And something that happened after the Great Recession was that there was a lot of austerity in a lot of rural counties and rural places. And so they cut a lot of public jobs. And so what happened then was that they actually lost a lot of purchasing power for these places, because once they lost public money that they got for working these jobs, then purchasing power for the whole county went down because the jobs disappeared, because they have multitudes of secondary, spending and those types of things that happen with that. The multiplier that, the economists always use when primary versus secondary jobs, et cetera. But I think that that's really interesting, especially in related to this, because I feel like rural governments tend to be sensitive to these types of cuts. But also when we're thinking about it, the doom loops that we think will happen to cities around the country right now when related to commercial real estate and the spending that's not happening from people being in offices, I feel like we've already seen this story from the rural perspective when they cut government jobs over time. And so it's this doom loop that's happening in rural areas that's showing us what would happen if we were to kind of lose control of the spiral over time. And so it's actually happened already in these areas. And I think that that's probably driving some of the frustration in some of these counties and some of the costs rising for projects. But also it just kind of shows that there's some good to be had for investing in government services and investing in public jobs as well.
It's expensive to be poor is a classic statement, whether that's someone who's buying a beat up bike and then it breaks a million times, or a government agency that's overstaffed and needs to rely excessively on consultants.
Understaffed?
Yeah, understaffed. Sorry, it's extremely expensive to be poor and have be understaffed and that. And I think the other part about that is when we talk about where is there waste? I think a lot about infrastructure and infill as the antithesis of waste. For me, when I think about waste, I think something that doing it today does not make it any easier tomorrow. I think a key part is for governments to do this kind of counter-cyclical spending, this spending where they should be stepping up when everyone else is stepping back, and say, what can they do today that's going to make tomorrow easier? And so for the downtown, saying, how do we get more people downtown? It's like, we'll make downtown office spaces smaller, more varied, more diverse. So people of all sorts of different interests, people still need space. People don't necessarily need to be in a giant open office plan with 300 people unmasked during a pandemic, but maybe they want a small office space or a small retail shop or a weird little museum for not to ever say that model rail cars are weird, but that there's all sorts of things. And if you just say, cool, what do we just do to get people there? How do we make this easier? I think that's a great thing. And I think like rural communities have to really struggle with this. And I think one thing where we see innovation in kind of small towns within rural communities is because they don't have the luxury of waste. They don't have the luxury to mess around. And I think just take Oakland, what our mayor is doing a really good job of saying, she put out a bunch of micro grants saying like, let's activate downtown spaces and getting all sorts of community groups to do events and festivals. And that's great. And then when you're in a tight fiscal position, that kind of forces innovation or death. I think there's a lot of great examples and what happens when you fund government and you fund efficiency and intelligence.
There was an article yesterday in the Chronicle, I think, talking about how they want to turn the Coliseum space into a second downtown where they could actually have more places potentially for people to get permits from the city or something, so they don't have to go all the way to downtown Oakland. I think that's really interesting thinking about it from that perspective too. But I'm wondering also, how are they going to fill that space if they have a second downtown?
Well, and but I think it's also for this stuff that cities across the country and they, trying to activate their downtown is a classic question that people had for decades and they'll have for decades more. And fun thing is we know the answer. And honestly, it's parties, it's festivals, it's parties, it's street fair, like it's parties, it's shrink the space. And it is, make it so it's easier for people to occupy it with whatever little innovations they have. So whether it's the Parisian booksellers or you have narrower streets, but kind of the enemy is sprawl. There's kind of the diffusion is the issue. And so when you have a smaller community and you put it's like you say Utrecht or any of these Dutch cities, it's like, okay, that's a lot of there are not that many people living there, but they're all within a fairly small geographic space. And that's what really helps liven up the street scene and all the other stuff.
Yeah. So last up, rise of the eco-village. More and more people around the world want to live sustainably, and to do so, they're joining eco-villages. 10,000 of these eco-villages exist globally, and their numbers are increasing every year. They're also increasingly tied to a type of spirituality that connects people to each other and back to nature, but often gets mistaken for cults. As the negative impacts of climate change increase, more people might try to find their eco-village. This was by Melissa Godine in Noma magazine. I don't know if I have much to say about this other than I think this was an interesting story. Noma always puts out good articles and interesting stuff. But I think that people are trying to find something that they can connect to. And I think the couple that was from Tokyo and that was featured in the article, they wanted something that wasn't living in a city, which is fine for some folks. For me, I love living in San Francisco, obviously. But I feel like people are feeling like they're disconnected from the land. They're disconnected from the environment, and they want to feel like that they're more in touch with something else than what they're doing at the time.
Yeah, I have a lot of snarky things to say on this, but I'm going to go with the sweet thing because you were very sweet about this, and I think you're right. I think this also connects back to the billionaire thing that I think there are a lot of folks who are lonely, and that's hard. I think some folks don't know how to hold community or make community. It's a learnable skill. It's a buildable skill. That's a hard thing. It breaks my heart when I hear people feeling alone in cities. I was a kid in the suburbs who, felt pretty alone. I felt suburbs is very stultifying in that sense. Cities are people all around you. There's an anonymousness in a city that for some people can be hard, but can be greatly liberating. And I think when people talk about the desire to connect with nature, we need to have, we need to depave more of our cities and create more parks. We need to create more natural oases within our communities and make this accessible. And we need to prevent sprawl so that when you do leave a city, you're not now in hundreds of miles of suburban wasteland, but now you're in beautiful nature to be more accessible. And I think that, people's desire for the wilderness or to desire to leave the grid and all these things comes from a real place of dissatisfaction. And I think that there's a lot to be said about the role of religion in society. And frankly, I think there's a bit of a need for a secular spirituality that I think folks have a hard time tapping into, and there aren't a lot of spaces for that. And I think people should create communities with their friends and folks like that. And you could do that where you are. I think when people talk about the need to go find themselves abroad or need to go, be out into the wilderness and hear themselves, you're wherever you are right now. And I encourage people to grow where they're planted. It is nice to get away from things for a bit, but not everyone has access to the great outdoors that we do have here in California. But yeah, I don't know, there's community all around. We just have to make it.
I'll leave with that. So I guess that's hard time to transition to some advertising, but I'm going to do it anyways.
Also, buying things is a real key to spiritual fulfillment.
It's really not. But I will say that if you do get fulfillment from listening to the show, you can become a Patreon supporter. We thank our generous Patreon supporters. You really are awesome and keep the show going. We really appreciate it by supporting every month. This show and Talking Headways wouldn't really be here without it. So thank you very much. And also, if you want to be a supporter, you can go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire, and we have $10 a month. You can get one of our scarves, one that we talked about earlier in the show, or you can do $2 a month and get a handwritten note and some stickers, including the Cars or Cholesterol stickers. So check that out if you get a chance. Also, you actually mentioned one of the first times we did a longer kind of read episode was episode 200, was Urbanism as a Way of Life by Lewis Worth. And I feel like that talks about the anonymity of being in an urban place, but also the empowerment of it, right? And so that's something separate from being in a small town. And I think that, Raymond Unwin went this direction too with his ideas in town planning and practice to a certain extent. So we did an audiobook. Go to raymondunwin.com and check that out if you get a chance. It's on American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Planning. It's the first one on the list. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. I'm more than happy to read those out on the air if folks want to send us notes. And folks send us notes a fair amount, but ask that they not be on read out, which is fine too. So feel free to do that. Puppies and Butterflies is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections. Well, so, in the town of Menacee, located south of Paris, they recently installed a bunch of road signs. And I feel like people have seen road signs for crossing animals, for cows and things like that, but they actually put one for a house cat. And so they have a crossing sign specifically for house cats. They also have ones for hedgehogs and horses and things like that. I feel like the horse one's actually pretty standard and that happens a lot of places, but not a lot of house cats crossings. So I thought that was kind of cool. And I'd like to see a lot of different animal crossings. And I feel like I've seen a number of different ones around the world that people have just kind of made randomly when I've been on my travels. But I just thought that was funny that they specifically called
crossings.
out. Yeah, unicorn crossings, those types of things. So I thought that was pretty fun, something fun that happened.
Well, and that's awesome. And for me, one of my Puppies and Butterflies is, so I train transportation activists. I also work with transportation advocacy groups. I meet a lot of people and am generally helpful in all sorts of different ways. And sometimes they are a little confused as to who I am and what I'm doing. Like, what's my goal there? It's like, oh, I'm just here to help you do a pro-transit thing. And they're like, oh. I was like, yeah. And so a really funny thing about the Rosie ride is, I reach out to the Rosie the Riveter people and pitch them on the idea of doing something with the ferry folk, and reach out to the ferry folk and said, hey, would you be interested? And, I was very clear, like, hey, I'm not either of these entities. I'm just kind of like the matchmaking friend. And they both said yes. And there's the Rosie the Riveter Trust got involved, and there's a restaurant right next door, and we got them involved. And there's the Columbia Sportswear thing, we got them involved. And it was just like really fun time. And then on the boat over, on the ferry ride over, some attendee who saw it in Fun Cheap SF comes up and they're like, oh, so are you like a historian? And I said, no, I mean, I like history, this, and Rose the Riveter is so inspiring. And they're like, oh, so do you work for the ferry folk? I was like, no, I mean, I'm working with them. And they're like, wait, so who are you? I was like, I'm just some guy who isn't afraid to talk to strangers and help them out do a thing that they want to do. And she was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And I was like, okay, good. I'm glad that was your decision on that one and not some other thing. But so it's just kind of a fun, like, people can make their eco villages, they could do whatever, and they could just make whatever community in their community. So it was a fun little Puppies and Butterflies moment.
I love it. Well, Carter, where can folks find you if people want, if you wish to be found, but also if they want you to maybe help them connect some folks together?
Yeah, so I do wish to be found. My website's carterlavin.com. You can find me there. I do one-on-one training sessions. I do group sessions. I do sessions for boards. I do workshops, things like that. I'm here to help activists on the transit and transportation world win their fights. I'm also on Blue Sky, moving off of Twitter, moving on to Blue Sky for various reasons. Carter Lavin is me there. That's my name. I'm around a lot of different places. Shoot me an email, say hi. And, people approach me with all sorts of visions and dreams that they have. And it's really a delight and honor to be able to say, yeah, that's not just a cool idea, but let's talk about how to make it reality. So to the listeners out there, I don't know, wow me, surprise me, stupefy me. I'm so excited to hear about your project.
Awesome. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm not going to call it that other thing, at The Overhead Wire, or at theoverheadwire.com. You can find me on Mastodon, The Overhead Wire, sfba.social. Thanks for joining us on Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thank you, Carter, for showing up for the show. We really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me on. I feel so excited to be on the show. I've listened for years and I've shouted things into the ether while you've talked about stuff. And so it's so fun to be able to say it to not just the ether, but to the wonderful listeners out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Hopefully it was positive shouts and not negative shouts. Although I imagine some of it was negative shouts.
It was all great shouts. Occasionally you say, oh, well, it's just political and who knows about that. And I just say, I know, I would love to talk about politics. So thank you for having me on.
Awesome. Well, everybody, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Talk